it's not as easy to get people out for a dull project of building accountability within the Ministry of Education. It's much easier to get people out on the streets to call for the downfall of the regime. So just the nature of the transitions makes it a major question of importance in the Arab world. But I know I'm running out of time, but I want to just throw out some variables between Tunisia and Egypt to jumpstart perhaps a conversation about what has made the difference between what has been effectively a positive transition and in Tunisia and Egypt, which has not really moved much at all. And I think we should look at context. Tunisia had traditionally spent 16 to 22% of its budget on education. The population was highly educated. The military was weak. Tunisia was not a U.S. patron. There were social cleavages, but it was mostly a homogeneous society. Egypt, on the other hand, had the 10th largest military. The military was very vested and controlling of the country. It was owning 10 to 40% of the economy and continues to have that interest. Egypt is a huge country of slightly more diversity, and it's socially conservative. So these are a set of circumstances, a context which enabled, I think, the Tunisians to move forward in an easier fashion. But many times people say, well, what was the situation in Egypt means that you can't expect a different outcome. But so I think as organizers, we would think of context as something to adapt to and strategize around. The other things, I'm just going to run them off really quickly because I'm out of time, is human agency. This is an important variable that I think has played out in what has made the difference in the directions that different countries in the region have taken. I think expectations matter. I think in Tunisia you see more activism at the community level, and in Egypt we are still at the macro level. The question of ripeness, when are our societies, communities ready to conduct themselves and organize themselves? There was a very strong labor movement in Tunisia, that was active. Egypt had a less independent labor movement. Syria, for instance, had no labor movement. So, and it had tighter restrictions. Syria had much more tighter restrictions on the society. So, whereas Egypt had more political openings. So the question of ripeness is one we need to take into account. And then I think just lastly, the other variable that I see very important in the context of the Arab Spring is violence versus civil resistance. And I think civil resistance is a much more effective means to mobilizing and transcending mobilization to organizing. And I can elaborate that later.
Thank you. Thanks. Next.
Mic check. It's the privilege of having a microphone. I like to make that joke pretty much every time. So I have to give a little very brief story of self, which I hate doing around Marshall. It's kind of like painting around Picasso. But I grew up as kind of the normal kid in a normal town. My brother and sister were both gay, and we were Jewish in a town that was not Jewish. And so I was on the sports teams, but the epithet was always like, oh, don't be such a fag, or don't be such a Jew. And so I simultaneously had the experience of really strongly being a part of a community and being accepted and understanding what it was like to be othered. And my mother, as Marshall mentioned, helped build a Jewish community center in the town, and so I saw kind of the value of that, although I was not personally very religious, and so I wasn't exactly accepted there. And then at some point, my father, who had a manufacturing business, sold his business to a company based out of Seattle and moved. for a job when the company shut down the manufacturing plant in the area that we were living. And so I came to see a real tension between capitalism and community because, it had such a profound effect on my family. And I guess I came to think of myself in some ways as a inside outsider. And so I always strove to work where I thought the fulcrum of change was. So initially, a lot of the projects I worked on were engaged in kind of building a progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And to me, that was my understanding of where the outside energy and momentum would get into the system. But I kind of always dreamed about the possibility of there being a actually organic outside movement. So, before Occupy, I think we really had three crises that amounted to a crisis of democracy or a crisis of representation. We hear a lot about the financial crisis and the economic crisis. We don't hear as much about the political crisis and kind of the challenge that we have in this country to make political decisions, and the institutional foundation for making those decisions is pretty corroded. When you have a national legislature with an approval rating below 10%, that's those are crisis numbers. And I think we also had a crisis of civic engagement where people don't have the same amount of civic participation. There aren't participatory institutions on the grassroots level that people can engage in to change their everyday life or to engage with other people. And one of the things that was so successful about Occupy was that I think it spoke to all those crises simultaneously and mobilized people to change all of them at once. And I was incredibly skeptical of Occupy. I was working for Rebuild the Dream, which was a much more NGO kind of typical organizing structure, went down to Occupy and was completely intoxicated very quickly because it allowed people to just be themselves in a way that I think most organizing contexts don't allow for. And it created a sense of community that was very, very real. And so, that led to a real challenge in terms of organizing, because if everyone can just be whoever they are, it's very difficult to come to any kind of alignment on values or strategy. But, you get people to do an incredible amount of stuff. So in terms of what mobilization and organizing looked like in Occupy, there was kind of no difference, which was sort of the problem. We mobilized instead of organizing. But we could not have done it if we didn't have really strong relationships. I'll just quickly tell the story of two successful mobilizations I was a part of. First, on October 5th, one of the first big mobilizations of the occupation, we turned out something like 15,000 people, and it was not as reported because the unions came and joined us. I think that they had a huge role in, frankly, Move On. But, there was just this sense of possibility and momentum, and we threw it out there, and people just showed up. So I think that really speaks in a lot of respects to the importance of momentum. And then, we decided, okay, it was time for another big day of action. On October 15th, there were these international days of action. And I remember sitting around with like 4 or 5 of my friends, and one person threw out, why don't we just do Times Square? And so we wrote up this crazy call to action and started organizing for, Times Square, and that turned out pretty okay. But we were nervous because we had no idea. That's a pretty big room if it's empty. So in terms of what the lessons are, I think, one thing I've seen is force equals mass times acceleration. And we had a lot of acceleration and not a lot of mass. And that worked for our context. If the goal is to get people doing the most amount of activity, then let them do whatever they want, and they'll do a lot. If the goal is to achieve some specific purpose, it's much more important to get specific alignment, and that was something that we really had a difficult time with. But, if you look at what happened with Occupy compared to, say, Fight for a Fair Economy, which I know there are folks here I don't want to disparage, but there was $100 and however many million spent to accomplish the same thing that Occupy achieved with $200 for cheese sandwiches. And I think the big lesson there is that it spoke to the scale of the problem, and that it worked backwards from what was necessary instead of looking out at what was possible. And that is just an inspiring and incredible thing to offer people an opportunity to do, and it was really transformational to me. And lastly, I'll close with, it worked because they didn't know that it wasn't supposed to, right? Like if they were organizers, right, and had to make a strategy chart, that would have looked really stupid. It would have been a really bad looking strategy chart. So as much as I think everything that we are doing here and the kind of ways that we're learning are incredibly important, I think it's also important to remember that there's a certain amount of hubris and a certain amount of just blue sky dreaming that are an incredibly important part of social change, and that's the only way we're ever going to fully succeed.
Thanks, man. Phil.
All right. I've got some slides. Don't worry, they don't have any words on them. Well, they have some words on them, but they're in the picture. Yeah, so the reason I'm putting up photos is because